We owe a lot to our coral reefs. Not only do they fortify our shorelines against extreme weather events, but they support entire ecosystems that provide us with food and livelihoods, filter toxins out of the ocean, absorb carbon dioxide, and produce a significant portion of our oxygen supply. Coral reefs have always taken good care of us, but we haven't exactly returned the favor. Our thoughtless actions over the years have drastically transformed the habitats these organisms depend on for survival, and as a result, they've been dying at an incredible rate all across the globe. Now, it's no secret that the world's coral reefs are in danger, but many of us remain blissfully unaware of the seriousness of this situation and the extent to which it's already impacting our own lives. Some people understand, though. People like Doug Marcy and Randy Cinski, who've been working tirelessly to try and turn things around in Bocas del Toro, Panama, through their organization, Caribbean Coral Restoration. We recently sat down with Doug and Randy to take a closer look at the coral crisis and hear about the work they've been doing. Doug, the founder of the organization, broke the situation down for us and outlined the organization's approach to reconstruction.
We wanted to prove that you could take a grassroots organization and make functional, effective differences by using local labor and local materials to make something positive happen.
While Randy, who serves as field director, provided us with additional insight on the impacts of the destruction.
This is a chain that is linked together very tightly between all of us. And as we start eliminating species, which we are doing at an unbelievable rate at this point, we come closer to eliminating our own species because it will happen eventually.
So let's talk about coral reefs and some of the efforts being made to save them in this episode of CESaRE Voices. Doug Marcy has always been interested in wildlife and the environment, but having grown up on a ranch in Nebraska, he didn't actually encounter the ocean until he'd already finished college. Once he did, he was hooked, and his love for the sea set him on a path that would eventually see him splitting his time between pursuing his professional career in the mountains of Colorado and visiting the tropical islands of Bocas del Toro, Panama, which effectively became his second home. By the time he was ready to retire to his island paradise, however, he noticed a steady decline in the diversity of the marine environment that had drawn him there in the first place, and a few years of research showed him that this was no temporary phenomenon. His beloved reefs were dying, and they weren't likely to recover on their own. Upon looking a bit further into the situation, Doug realized that the same thing was happening pretty much everywhere in the world, and that there were actually people and organizations dedicated to the recovery and preservation of marine ecosystems. Considering everything the reefs had given him throughout his life, Doug knew it was time to give back by joining the effort. So, how long ago did Caribbean Coral Restoration get started? And I mean, what was it like in the very beginning? How did you pull things together initially?
Well, initially I started about 10 years ago. I started researching what coral were and learning everything that I could about them and introducing myself to the people who had already established coral restoration facilities. And there were a lot, the two biggest operations were in Florida. So I went there and went to their front door, and they were gracious enough to teach me and encourage me to start doing something. Their answer was, to my question, can I do something, was yes. And told me and mentored me, a lot of it by phone and by a yearly visit each year to look in their facilities and actually physically see what they were talking about, learn what to do and how to do it, and then started trying to get the permissions from Panama to practice what I knew. And that took 3 years. But what was easy to get permission to do was to create habitat. So we spent the first 3 years after we had actually formed the company of coral restoration to create habitat for the coral to live on. Because when the reefs collapsed, all of those formations that were made by the coral from their calcium skeletons collapsed as well. So the habitats disappeared, the fisheries disappeared. So we knew we had to create something artificial, at least temporarily, for us to be able to outplant the coral on, because if we put them on what was there that was already covered with algae or buried in the sand, they were going to die. So that's what got us on the track of artificial reef habitats.
Okay, I see. And I mean, we could probably get into the coral itself, right?
Yes.
You know, what what is the singular most important thing you would say that the coral reefs provide to our ecosystem?
Oxygen. They are the foundation of what happens in the ocean. They probably 80% of what exists in the ocean has some connection to reef structures. It creates the food chain from everything to the microorganisms all the way to the major inhabitants of the sea. So if we lose the reefs, that chain is broken. And in all of the things that occur in the reef, 60% of the oxygen that's produced in the world comes from the ocean. So coral, if coral are the foundation of that, let's assume that all of a sudden we no longer have that oxygen production. So take a half a breath and see how that works for you.
So, what exactly is happening to them, and what's causing that?
Well, you can say it in 2 words: human impact. And it starts with all of the changes that we've made in the ocean. And to think that 3/4 of our globe is covered with water, and that we've made a change enough in that environment that it's changed the atmosphere. It's not only changed the ocean, it's changed the currents in the ocean, which changes the currents in the air, which climate change. I mean, all of those things are directly affected by what happens in the ocean. So the coral adapted to a static environment that didn't change for millions of years. And then all of a sudden, you've got a temperature increase. Let's just talk about temperature. You got a temperature increase of 2 degrees. Well, that doesn't sound like very much, but if you have a temperature 2 degrees higher than what your normal temperature is, you're home in bed and your wife's feeding you through a straw. You're sick. And so the coral are the same way. They got sick. They'd already been fighting all the affluents in the ocean, the differences in how much debris is in the ocean. The chemical content of the ocean has changed over time. And it wasn't a short amount of time. It was a few decades where they had hundreds of thousands of years to determine what was the way of the ocean. Now all of a sudden we turned a switch and changed it. And they're very adaptable. They're amazing creatures. Coral are a tiny little animal, and they can adapt, but it takes some time to do that. So what we're doing in coral restoration is trying to buy them that time. The big thing that has hurt them now is temperature rise, and that's universal throughout the globe. All of the other things added up, but once you get that temperature, and in some places we're 10 degrees over what the normal was in the ocean water temperatures. And it's not just surface temperature, it's temperatures at depth that have skyrocketed.
To really understand the impact of rising ocean temperatures on the coral, we have to think about some of the processes underlying their survival as a species. Take reproduction, for instance.
Well, the coral are like any other animal. They have ways of reproduction. And one of the ways that they reproduce is by releasing egg and sperm at the same time. And a colony of corals will be one particular coral that split itself over and over and over and over and over again until it became a formation specific to that coral species. Each one of those, they're called polyps, can release either an egg or a sperm. And on a certain night, on a certain hour, generally once a year, they have a spawning event. All of that species in that region.
Oh, wow.
Somehow they send out a memo and say, hey, it's August 23rd this year, be ready. And so when that happens, all of that can interchange. But the trick is that there has to be a different family of that same species to make a combination.
Right.
That won't combine with itself. So it has to have a different family of the same species in order for it to combine. Well, the coral died so quickly that they didn't have time to have enough of those they're called genotypes close enough to each other. So during that spawning event, that mix was possible. Generally, the male, the sperm, only lives for about an hour. So it's got to drift somewhere and find something to connect to that's not in its own family. Can't be a cousin, can't be a brother.
Right.
So what we did is we tried to identify those genotypes, those different families, take specimens from each one of them, propagate those specimens, generally by cloning, which meant that we took small pieces of them, let them grow, and then divided and then divided and divided. So we'd take one piece, and over a 2-year period, it would turn into hundreds of that clone, of that genotype, that family. Then when we would outplant them, we would take some from each one of the families that we identified as being different and outplant them together. So when they spawned, they had the ability for something to happen. That was the path we were on up until about 2 years ago.
Of course, the coral isn't the only marine life form being affected, especially considering its connection to so many other forms of aquatic life. And this is where wildlife experts such as Randy Cinski come into play. Randy is a wildlife biologist with an interest in veterinary medicine and a passion for saving endangered species. She was already living in Panama by the time she met Doug, who, in her own words, taught her more than she ever thought she'd know about corals and the situation facing them, prompting her to join the restoration effort as well. In terms of the impacts of the destruction of the coral reef, can you speak a little bit about what you've observed in terms of the wildlife that is impacted by this?
I think one thing that everybody knows that impacts wildlife is habitat destruction. So this is true for the coral as well, right? Their habitats are being destroyed. The other marine animals in that vicinity, in that area, their habitat is being destroyed as the reefs collapse. So this is all connected. This world is all connected. And when we go and take out huge chunks and acreage of land and essential habitat for certain species, we're one step closer to destroying us, is what it is. So people think, oh, what's the big deal if that turtle dies, or that species of coral dies, or that bird dies? They all become extinct. So what? This is a chain that is linked together very tightly between all of us. And as we start eliminating species, which we are doing at an unbelievable rate at this point, we come closer to eliminating our own species, because it will happen eventually. We'll just, frizzle up and go like everybody else. So when people say, "What does it matter? What does it matter under the ocean, or what does it matter up in the trees, or what does it matter in the creek? The little fish that's swimming around, it's gonna, there's two left. What does it matter?" It's all connected. It's all, so it does matter. Everything matters.
Are there noticeable, I mean, okay, there's going to be obvious noticeable landscape changes with the coral itself being depleted, right?
Well, sure, because shoreline, right? Shoreline disappears. So as the reefs disintegrate and deteriorate and disappear, then the wave action coming into the shores are eating away more and more of the shoreline. I've seen meters of shoreline disappear just in the short time I've been here. And then eventually that falls in, and then there's a landslide from above with the jungle trees coming down into the water, and then that mud and silt goes into the ocean and starts to suffocate other animals. It just keeps going. So so yeah, there's a lot. And then Doug mentioned the oxygen, that anywhere from, I've heard, as low as 50 to as high as 70%. So let's say 60% of the oxygen we breathe is coming from the ocean. Everybody thinks it's coming from the trees, and the trees do something, but most of what we're getting is from the ocean. So we poison and destroy this ocean, and there's no life left in this ocean. Take a half a breath, and that's where you're going to be breathing.
Oof, wow. People need to understand that this is not just a small island developing state situation or a tropical situation. It's ultimately going to affect us all. You mentioned earlier that, you guys realized that there were others working to solve the problem, or to at least address the issue. Can you tell us a little bit about any efforts that you have seen or heard of across the globe?
I'm probably pretty confident in saying that there were less than half a dozen coral restoration operations at any level in the Caribbean when we started. And now there's, I don't know, 20 or 30 of them. So there are a lot of people who at least are trying to do something. Some of it's a little bit misguided, especially with as fast as things are changing. We as practitioners have to change our methodologies and how we approach the problem too, in order to keep up with what's happening. No, I don't think anybody anticipated what's happening to be an event that accelerated over the last 3 to 4 years like it has. And that's worldwide, that's happening in the ocean.
There's no two ways about it. Coral reefs are quickly being wiped out all across the globe. And as Doug points out, those working to restore them must explore new angles of approach in order to keep up. One example of this can be seen in Barbados, whose south and west coasts have experienced massive levels of coral decline, as well as an overgrowth of algae, which is basically being fed by nutrients from land-based sources such as fertilizers and sewage systems. Now, in this particular case, two organizations, the Blue-Green Initiative and the Global Coral Reef Alliance, are working together to propose a solution through a pilot project funded by our sponsor, the Barbados Environmental Conservation Trust. The project aims to create artificial reefs using biorock technology, which involves running safe, low-voltage electrical currents through seawater to generate a type of limestone. Coral can then be grown on these artificial reefs, and they're actually allowed to do so at an accelerated rate, thanks to changes in the habitat produced by the electrical current. Now, this technology isn't exactly new. It's been around since the late 70s, and it's been used for coral restoration in more than 20 countries since the early 80s. But its first time use in Barbados gives us an idea of the different approaches being taken by practitioners such as Doug and Randy.
It's not hopeless. We see a lot of things about other industries, other operations that are worried about how to mitigate erosion, how to mitigate what we put into the air, how to mitigate what we put into the rivers. So we're not alone. We're all working at something at a different level from different directions, but it has to be a lot more public awareness of what's happening so that we can do simple things. Everybody can do something, even if it's just turn off the light. Every time you do something that keeps that energy at a minimal makes a difference. You got 8 billion people on the planet, and you got 8 billion lights that all go off on the same time. You think that makes an impact? Of course it does. Little things add up to big impacts. So think about what you can do. Do you really need that thing in a plastic container, or can you source it somewhere else that's not a single use object that's going to wind up in a landfill or floating in the ocean?
I see what you're saying. And, Randy, in our conversations prior to this, you mentioned something that I just think is really important because with all the good actors that we'll see in response to situations like this, there are always the opportunists, people out there who are unfortunately taking advantage of the situation more than trying to really address it.
There's a name for this practice. It's called greenwashing, and these are people that take advantage of the plight of what's going on, and this can happen with other areas of the environment as well. But it's a big thing right now with coral restoration and coral rescue, because it's getting to be a buzzword. Like, people are starting to hear about it. They're not quite sure what to do about it, or, well, here, look at this group. They look beautiful, and look at all their pictures are beautiful, and so let's donate to them. Well, chances are they're more of a greenwasher, right? Because the amount of time and effort put into making sure that your photo ops are absolutely perfect, is the one who gets the money thrown at them. And there's been other projects throughout the years like this, where cancer research, or save the tot, whatever it is, they've always managed to find where they build these nonprofits so big that the main people running them are taking home a whole lot of money, and it's not going into what the efforts really need to be. And I think we all know about this. We all worry about where to throw our money for that reason. We want to make sure that it goes directly to what it needs to go to. So the practitioners that are in there doing the groundwork and can talk to you and tell you this is what your money's going for are the ones that really could use the help. So the multi-million-dollar restoration groups, I don't even know how you have that much money trying to save the ocean, right? Like, should it be in the water, right?
Exactly.
So when your bank account's pretty high, I don't know. I don't know. It seems that there's something not quite right there. If it doesn't sound right, if it walks like a duck and sounds like a duck, it's probably a duck. So smart about where you throw your money, and also hold people accountable. Hold the big corporations accountable for what they're doing. And if they're not going to listen, then don't buy their products. It does make a difference.
It's important to remember that all of us have a part to play in the effort to turn things around.
I want people to stop getting to this point where they're thinking, oh, what can I do? Isn't that a shame? Oh boy, wow, it's going to be a tough day when this all, well, what? Stop driving to the store every day. Stop leaving lights on. Turn your heaters, put on a sweater, for God's sakes. It's just this wastefulness. I want to know whoever invented like the whole plastic container system, where you go to the store and buy plastic containers to put food into it that then leach chemicals into your hot food, and now you're poisoning yourself. So when you have containers at home like glass bottles, wash them out, take the labels off with vinegar, and use those as storage containers. There's so much we can do. And when you live like we're living here, you tend to figure out ways to recycle and upuse everything because you have to. So when I go back to the States and I see this wastefulness, I just drives me crazy. Showers run forever, dishwashers running, and washing machines washing one pair of pants. And it's just, you can't do that here. You won't survive.
I can see how you feel about it, and it resonates with me, And when you spoke earlier there too about, when you see an organization that's supposed to be helping and their bank account is growing, I mean, it really throws shade at the idea of non-profit, right?
Yeah.
And this is why we're talking to you guys, because what I
There
really
is no
love,
bank account here.
exactly,
Literally.
Yeah, I'll show you my bank account. Yeah, right.
No, but you see, and that's what I love about you guys is that you're not going that route. I imagine it's a challenge because, as you rightly pointed out, Randy, the way things seem to work these days is that you have to almost shine bright to even attract funding and everything like that, right?
Right.
So I see where you guys will have to have a website at least or something. But what I do enjoy though is your sort of grassroots approach, this holistic approach that you guys have. The philosophy. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I think one of the things that we did from the very beginning was we wanted to be a benefit to the community, not only to the ocean and not only to the world as a whole, but we wanted to benefit directly the people that live here. And so what we know is we know what needs to happen. We're not going to be able to afford multi-million-dollar or even $100,000 pieces of equipment like a lot of places that do what we do are able to do. We wanted to prove that you could take a grassroots organization and make functional, effective differences by using local labor and local materials and creating everything that you needed to make something positive happen. So nobody that's on the administration takes a wage. Nobody gets paid. We're all volunteers. But who we hired were the indigenous peoples in the neighborhood and encouraged them to learn something beyond what they were probably would ever have the ability to. So by working here, they learn technical skills all the way from carpentry to welding to management of wildlife, environmental changes, how to on land and in the sea. We actually certify divers to be able to go down and work in the ocean. But all of the people that work here are indigenous from the indigenous communities in this area. They're our best ambassadors because they're amazed at what they see. They're amazed at the changes that happen. And we're extremely successful in what our program has been able to accomplish with funding that's less than the average operational executive gets in some of these organizations. For our whole total budget is less than that for the year.
Caribbean coral restoration has achieved remarkable results by directly involving members of the indigenous community in its restoration efforts. And the organization's use of innovative techniques plays a major role in the effectiveness of this approach.
So we've created some seed banks, a seed bank facility where we now bring things out of the ocean. It's a genobank, if you will. We bring coral out of the ocean and protect it, especially if we see that maybe these are the last ones left in this area. That may mean they're going to be the last ones left in the Caribbean. We don't know that. We don't dive everywhere in the Caribbean. We dive a lot of this country, and we are very familiar with the population base of most of the coral species here. So when we see something that we know is probably going to not make it, and we don't have time to collect, propagate, and outplant all of them. They're dying too fast. So we have to have that genobank. So we've created that, and we've created it with a budget that is less than a new pickup on a prairie. The relativity of what we're doing and the cost of how we're producing those results is pretty amazing. And what we want to do is be able to teach other people how to do this. It's not rocket science. We know how to create artificial reef structures and place them in the ocean in ways that are environmentally friendly. The materials are environmentally friendly. They're the kind of things that the creatures in the ocean need to be able to survive and want to attach to. And what we've done as proof of concept, if we start out a rehab area in what's essentially a desert under the water, there's no life there. Within 3 years, we'll have almost a complete biosystem reestablished. In 5 years, we have everything from the shrimp to the big predators in there. So it can be done. And there's also hope for the coral because there are resilient species of these coral. Whenever anything happens, there's always somebody there that doesn't get the memo. And they just say, okay, I'm tough enough. I can do this. Stand back, hold my beer, watch this. And they do well. So what we're doing is indexing those, protecting those, and then propagating those. And the technology exists now for us to be able to do that in mass. We're 5 years away from that with the budget we have. But we know how to do it. We know where to get people to help us do it. If we get somebody to give us $1 million today, we know the people to go to help us. Within a year from now, we could be actually producing results that would really make a difference in the coral outcome. We're making a difference in the fisheries right now that is undeniable. We could do the same thing with the coral.
Doug and his team have already shown that they can get the job done, even with the limited resources at hand. But that's not the real issue here.
If you ignore the timeline, we can keep going forever on what we're doing. But to ignore the timeline is really irresponsible. So every chance we get, we try to broadcast, this is what we've done with this much. Think of what your input could create if we had the ability to hire more people, to use more materials, to influence what we already know works in the water, and then pass that on to other people like us. There are all kinds of organizations that want to do what we do. We could save them all of the learning curve. We could tell them, well, yeah, you can do that, but if you do, blah, blah, blah. Or maybe they know they have something else that we can try that will get results quicker than they would because we're already set up with all of the stuff that it takes to put that into practice to see if it works and then pass that on. So it needs to be, that information exchange needs to be increased. The amount of actual active participation needs to increase in order for this to happen in a meaningful way.
I like that you brought that up, especially information exchange. I think that's very important because people tend to operate in these silos a lot of the time. And people do really need to sort of network more and join the efforts. Are there other things that you would say need to be done as well in order to, boost the effort?
Well, the thing that kind of makes you crazy is the organizations that have the ability to do things are not paying attention. Government agencies could do more than they do. The time for research is over. Most of what needs to be known is known. It's amazing to me when I see a researcher come in here and they do a specific program and they spend 6 months at it and thousands of dollars to find out a result, and they could have just given me a phone call, and in 5 minutes I could have told them everything they were going to find out because we've done it. There's a tremendous amount of information. We didn't get there because we knew everything. That's for sure. We got there because we used that research. It's applied science is what we're doing. So it's not like we're operating by the seat of our pants and just hoping something works. All of this has been shown to be effective. And some of it we learned and were able to improve on and modify. And like you say, that needs to be disseminated. More and more people need to know about that.
You went specifically into like seeing these researchers come and spend all this money and everything to study things. You guys are at the grassroots. You're literally working with the indigenous community in most cases. Something that I see that's a recurring theme with some of our guests is that the knowledge from the people who are actually there on the ground, not just persons like yourself, but persons who are from the
area. Absolutely. Yep.
Right. Tends to be overlooked, right? I imagine you guys have gained a lot of knowledge just by engaging the local community.
Absolutely. We had, in my mind, I had some ideas about what the structures needed to be when we started out to build artificial reef structures. And so I had the guys built them to my specifications. And then once they started helping put them in the water and saw what we were actually doing and understood why we were putting them there and what we were doing, they'd say, well, yeah, but the lobsters like it if blah, blah, blah. And if you want eels in there, and if you want octopus in there, and if you want, they knew what it takes. Big fish like, so it was X, Y, and Z. And so we started modifying not only the individual structures that we made, but the way we organized those structures in configurations once we got to the ocean with them. And it was a lot to do with what the guys taught us by their experience that came from generations of living here in these waters, families living in these waters.
It might be good to note too that these the generations that lived off of the ocean and the protein in the ocean and made their living by selling different products from the ocean, that no longer exists. The fish aren't there, the lobsters aren't there, the octopus. I haven't even seen an octopus this year yet. So, and I'm in the water almost every day. So that free protein source that helped feed these communities is gone. So now this is communities that are mostly feeding families with white rice and sugar. And if by chance they would happen to catch a big fish, they're going to sell it to the local restaurant so that they have more money to buy rice and sugar, right? So I think that's really important to understand. And this is on like the beginning level, right? This is just people that live and paddle in cayuks to back and forth to where their families are, where they're working. Catching fish on the way home no longer exists. Line fishing, that kind of thing with like a single, like a line. I'm literally a line and maybe a bottle that they roll it up on. So that no longer exists. And eventually this is going to affect everybody. Eventually you're not going to be able to go to Costco and pick up some salmon, wild caught salmon. There's places in Alaska where the indigenous community there, they can no longer get the salmon. They can't catch it. And then what they have as income to go to the store and have to buy some other type of protein, it's so expensive that it makes it almost impossible. So you back to, the cheapest type of carbohydrate, and then you have health problems. And then there's, infant mortality because the mothers don't have the protein in their milk to feed the babies, and the babies are dying at a way faster rate in these coastal communities. I know at least here for sure.
As is sadly often the case, it's the indigenous population that has been impacted most directly by the deterioration of the reefs. despite having very little to do with the destruction. But again, the rest of us need to wake up to the fact that we aren't exactly immune to the long-term effects.
It's so interwound into everything. And if you think, oh, that's over there, that's in this little third world country in Central America, you're wrong. It eventually is going to hit you. It's eventually going to reach into the middle of wealthy countries. If you think that that's not going to happen, then you haven't watched what's happened so far. Look at the prices of food. Look at how things disappear. The amount of seafood that is harvested from the ocean right now is sickening. I don't know what the purpose is. I don't know why people are continuing to do this and buy this stuff, thinking that this is a more sustainable way. There's no sustainable seafood out there. There's none. So that's a fallacy. And where'd the fish go? Their homes or the reefs, right? So when the homes collapse, if your house burns down, you're going to go find another place to live. And regardless of where that is, you're going to find a place to live. You have to find some shelter, right? So the fish, it's the same way. When the reef collapses, the fish leave. They have to find somewhere else to go. They have to find somewhere else where they can continue on doing what they're doing. So they hide from predators. They have small places where they can breed, and then the fry grow up and become bigger fish. But when that reef is gone and the houses collapse, they've got to figure out another way to survive. So when we put these artificial reef structures into the water, we create these new homes for these animals, and they're all for it, as we're lowering them into the water, but fish come into them as a place to stay. So, yeah.
That actually brings me around to this question, which is just, is there a particular project of yours that you guys just want to talk about, you want people to hear more about?
Yeah, there's two actually. One is the genobank that we're facilitating here. And that's an onshore place where we're bringing coral out of the ocean and protecting them, putting them in an environment that's survivable for them and protected from the diseases and things that are happening in the ocean because of the changes in the temperatures and what's available nutrient-wise for these organisms to proliferate. So we're trying to bring them in and give them time enough that we can artificially induce spawning in those species and then take those spawn, let them turn into the larvae, and then settle on the coral or settle on the substrate that we put in the water so that they can become coral. And then those coral, having already been chosen as adaptive species, will be able to have a spawning event that works naturally. And instead of us putting in a couple of 100,000 new arrivals a year, they'll put in millions each year by themselves. And that's what's going to make the difference. So, yes, our project, our long-range goal is to create that gene bank where we can protect the species that we know are resilient and are necessary to recreate the natural reefs, and then be able to propagate those in an advanced, accelerated method that makes sense for all of us. The other thing we want to do is take the reef that we have started as a proof of concept reef out here in front of our facility and take it all the way to the front end of this island. It's about 1.5 miles, and recreate that whole area that used to be a live, viable, basically barrier reef, and make that fishery whole again, make that biodiversity come back as we know it will. It might be a bit different than what was here 20 years ago, but we know that given the opportunity, something will happen there that's meaningful. And it will be meaningful for the entire community. It will be meaningful for the world as an example of what can happen. So those are the two things that are my dream world, if you want to call it that. That's my goal, to create those possibilities.
global warming is causing major changes to our oceans, including sea level rise, temperature increase, and acidification. It's also increasing the frequency and severity of storms, heat waves, and flooding. These things cause enough harm to coral reefs on their own, but they can also have a compounding effect on other threats, such as land-based pollution. It's all working together to destroy important marine ecosystems, threatening our lives in the process. And it's happening so quickly that it seems almost impossible for us to counteract the destruction. When we think about issues like this, it can often feel as though we're struggling to keep our heads above water. But organizations like Caribbean Coral Restoration are showing us that the right attitude and approach can actually turn the tide. Caribbean Coral Restoration is already making great strides towards its goal of rehabilitating the marine ecosystems of Bocas del Toro, and its effectiveness as an organization seems to stem from the ability of its members to see the big picture while maintaining awareness of the fact that it's ultimately composed of much smaller elements. Anyway, that's all we have for you on this episode of CESaRE Voices. We'd like to thank our guests for taking the time to share their insights with us. We'd also like to thank our funded partner, the Barbados Environmental Conservation Trust, or BECT, for making this episode possible. BECT aims to help Barbados reach its national development goals by supporting initiatives aimed at environmental sustainability. Of course, we'd also like to thank our listeners for tuning in to the CESaRE Voices podcast. If you like what you've been hearing so far, feel free to give us a rating wherever you're listening. We'd also like to remind you that you can visit our website, CESaRjournal.org/donations, to lend your financial support. Or join our monthly donor club on Patreon to gain access to exclusive content, or even be featured on an episode of our podcast. Just click the link in the description. You might also want to check out the CESaRE Journal YouTube page for exclusive clips and videos on all kinds of topics related to Caribbean sustainability. And if you'd like to sponsor an episode of CESaRE Voices and feature your company or NGO, please click on our corporate link to learn more.